Articles of Confederation and problems. So keep in mind, last time we finished up with all of the information about like the state governments and everything like that. So this is really looking at the federal government. So the Articles of Confederation is actually the federal government that America was under during the Revolutionary War. It was originally submitted to the states in 1777. And under it, each state retained like sovereignty, freedom, and independence. And basically, in it, every power not specifically stated in this document and expressly delegated, that is expressly delegating a specific power to the United States Congress, if it's not specifically listed, then the state retains that power. This means that this central government is severely limited in its powers that have been delegated into it. There's no provision for a national judiciary. There is no separate executive branch of the government. So really, Congress is the sole instrument of national authority. And even that is going to be restricted with a series of safeguards to keep it from threatening the interests of the states. The way that Congress was set up under the Articles of Confederation is basically each state has one vote in Congress. It doesn't matter how big or how small the state is, every state has one vote, and that is it. For things regarding like finances, war and peace, they're going to require an approval from a majority of 9 of the delegations voting in Congress. So 9 out of 13 have to vote for these kinds of changes. And in fact, if they wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, this is going to require unanimous consent of the states. So all 13, and then eventually, as more states are added in, 14, 15, and so on and so forth. But all 13 when it's initially made. Congress technically had authority in areas of like foreign policy, national defense. They were, for instance, the ones that would declare war, make peace, conduct in foreign affairs, like negotiating with Native Americans, and they were supposed to be the ones that could settle disputes between states. The problem is they give them very severe, it's very limited in exactly what specifics it could do. For instance, like it had no, like it could declare war, but they didn't have the authority to raise troops or impose taxes that, would pay for war. So what you see here more than anything else is that it's very clear that the American people at this time feared the oppressive. They gave Congress no more power than what was absolutely necessary. Most states were actually very quick to ratify it, but even at this point, when they gave Congress so little authority, Maryland actually held out for a time until like 1781 due to there being this issue with that Virginia's original charter included a lot more land, and basically once Virginia gave up a lot of that land further west, basically Maryland then agrees to it. So even with severely limited powers, you can see that problem that could present itself in the future with like amendments. Think of today, if we had to get unanimous consent to get any amendment through or anything done in like Congress, how difficult that would be. So I ask you this question. It is an opinion question. This is actually part of your discussion. Basically, do you think the government under the Articles of Confederation could have ever worked? And I want you to think about why or why not, or if you're like, oh, I think it would work, but they would have needed to change this or that. Like, I want you to think about it and explain it and, like I said, discuss this. Go ahead and pause this if you want to make some notes about it, because I'm going to push forward. So there are some problems, though, at home in America during this time period. Just because there was peace didn't necessarily mean that there was prosperity or political stability. And we're going to see a lot of these issues come during this time, like a fiscal crisis. The thing is, war is expensive. And so there's a lot of heavy debt that had been taken to finance the Revolutionary War. But the American government couldn't collect enough taxes to cover these without reserves of like gold and silver. And to borrow funds, they had to issue like certificates or bonds pledging repayment. The problem is they're just generally printing more and more money, and so inflation is rampant. Keep in mind, there isn't those reserves of gold or silver, not in America at this time or anything. This is when like the army is going unpaid. That's when there's that whole unrest within the army and everything that I talked about previously. Congress is going to cease to pay interest on the public debt. And so they have this idea within Congress that Congress, so that they could create like this union across the states, they should have Congress assume the payment of the entire national debt. The idea here is that if Congress assumes all of the debt of all of the different states, that basically this is going to mean that the propertied classes are going to identify their economic self-interest with having an effective power within the national government. Because if the national government is who owes you money, then you want the national government to succeed so that they can pay you back, basically. But if Congress is going to assume, the national government is going to assume all of the United States debt, they need the power to tax so that they can actually pay for that debt. So Congress is going to try to propose a national tax of 5% on imported goods. However, this would need an amendment to the Articles of Confederation. And right away, Rhode Island is going to reject this, and it's going to be sent to its defeat. They then revised the plan, and right away that time, New York rejected it. So that's the thing. We're going to see that without the power to tax in Congress, basically Congress is held hostage to the sovereignty of all the individual states. It has no real authority over the nation's economic affairs. Under the Articles of Confederation, so think today we tend to have a hierarchy within our government that you have your local governments, but then, the state government is going to technically have authority over those local governments, and then the federal government has authority over the state governments. This is reversed the other way around, where the state government is really more powerful than the federal government. And the problem with that is that you can't have cohesiveness within an entire nation that way. In many ways, people compare the Articles of Confederation almost to the European Union today. And then we also are going to see at this time period, looking at all the problems, an economic depression. The thing is, Britain during the war had closed markets to American goods. Makes sense. But after the war is over, they're going to continue on with this policy because they basically want to keep the United States weak and dependent on them. So, for instance, they would exclude America from trading with the West Indies, but they would sell lots of items to America. They were happy to, satisfy Americans' demand for consumer items, but even this, they would require the payment of hard currency. The problem is America doesn't have hard currency anymore, except for through maybe some foreign loans and what the French army might have spent during their war, during their time in America. And so we get this economic depression that's actually going to last most of the decade. The problem is a lot of Americans are going to owe Great Britain merchants a lot of debts, and so they're not necessarily paying those back. But on top of that, just Americans in general had borrowed money during the war, and we're going to see merchants are going to start pressing for the immediate payments from debtors, and debtors are just unable to pay. So when we talk about creditors versus debtors, debtors are someone who owes money to a creditor. So creditor, they've loaned out money at some point. So the problem is when debtors are unable to pay, wages fall and people start selling on credit. There's all kinds of lawsuits when it comes to the collection of debts. There's the possibility of losing land. So think about people being foreclosed on because they're not paying off their house and things like that. And then there's just not enough money in circulation to raise prices. People need to spend money so that there's money in circulation, because think if you're a creditor and you're a merchant and suddenly no one's paying back their debts, maybe you don't have money to pay for that journeyman in your shop or anything, and so you let them go. Well, that means that they're not buying anything, and if they're not buying anything, and this is happening across the United States in multiple places, then other merchants aren't making money, and so then they have to let their people go, and so you can see how this becomes a domino effect, so to speak. Congress as well is unable to pay off their old debts. They weren't even really able to pay what they owed soldiers. And then on top of that, each of the states are having their own problems with like crops and such. And that's a lot of it, is it goes into the economic policies of the states at this time. There's not a uniform national policy against the British, and so this dooms all efforts to hurt the British and their retaliatory measures against America. The thing is, if they had done like that 5% imported tax on like just British goods, that would have hurt the British, and like we saw how effective the non-importation movements were leading up to the American Revolution. But instead what happens is each state has their own different regulations, and so a lot of times shippers would just go through less restrictive states or states that had no tariff at all. And then of course states without ports would complain, because basically if they wanted to purchase goods from other states with ports, they might have to pay that tariff, but the state government wouldn't then get any of the revenue from the tariff. And so we're also going to see already at this time sectional tensions are being shown between the North and the South states. Basically they have different interests. The Southern states generally tended to favor free trade policies that encouraged British imports. Whereas the North more likely was going to have these retaliatory measures and tariffs against British goods. And then we also even see a division amongst debtors versus creditors within the state. So that's actually when we look at like Shays' Rebellion. So the thing is, Shays' Rebellion occurred in fall of 1786. What had happened was in Western Massachusetts, we're seeing a lot of like farm foreclosures and imprisonment for the failure to pay on debts. And this is really problematic because think if someone owes money and then their farm is foreclosed on them, they have no way of making that money to actually pay it back. If they're being put in prison, they have no way of making that money to pay it back. So this is problematic economically as well. And the thing is, the reason this was going on is creditor and seaboard interests in the legislature closer to the coast are going to refuse to pass any kind of relief measures. And so what happens is some 2,000 farmers took up arms against the Massachusetts state government. Now, outside of Massachusetts, generally debtors stopped short of, armed resistance because of success in like changing monetary policy of their states. So most states enacted laws for like new paper money to be issued, or like they'd combine that with laws that prevented or delayed creditors from seizing property of debtors, which satisfied the debtors. So it'd be very much like, oh, you might have to face these certain legal consequences, but we're not going to foreclose on your farm so that you can continue to farm and maybe eventually pay back all of your debts. And actually see the opposite extreme right there in Rhode Island next door to Massachusetts, because Rhode Island, on the other hand, would just print money and then put it into law that that money could be used to pay all their debts, and that creditors had to accept this new money at face value or they were subject to heavy penalties, which was really problematic because the thing is all this money is being printed and it is not worth its face value. And so this was actually a really big concern for creditors because they felt like these controlling legislative bodies were dangerous and not allowing them to actually make the money back that they had originally loaned. So we start seeing like conservatives, creditors, and nationalists all speaking about like democratic tyranny and that this needs to be checked if the republic is going to survive, that the system that we have under the Articles of Confederation is not working. I want to mention though a couple successes within the Articles of Confederation really fast. We are going to see things like the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This is the most significant legislative act that is successful under the Confederation. Basically, this is Congress creating a political structure for the territories in this region you can see on this map, becoming and achieving statehood. I'm not going to go into all the specifics of how they became states, but I want to mention a couple things. It stipulates, first of all, that in this region, only 3 to 5 states could be formed in the Northwest. The reason for this is every new state that is admitted into the Union is going to weaken the control of Congress the original 13 states had. Because think about it, if there's 13 states, every state has 1 vote. Well, suddenly if there's 14 states, your vote counts as less. So they're going to keep this in mind. Also, there's going to be a slavery ban in this region as well. And the South actually liked this because they feared competition from these new states. Because if they ban slavery, then they can't enslave people and use these people to produce specific crops that generally used slave labor. So it means less competition. Plus, the South expected slavery to be allowed in the region south of the Ohio River Valley. And this is going to be the case. Slavery is going to be allowed in that area under the Southwest Ordinance of 1790, but that's later. So we're just seeing diplomatic weaknesses here. Congress has the authority to negotiate, foreign treaties, but no economic or military power to actually enforce their terms under the Articles. Yes, they could regulate commerce or set tariffs to a certain extent, but they couldn't leverage really to open up trade with other empires like France and Spain and Britain, even to a certain extent. And so while we're on friendly terms with France after the war, Britain is clearly treating the colonies with contempt, and we're going to see even more problems between the United States and Great Britain at this time.